When I first started teaching, I was very involved in repertoire selections for my students. And when I say very involved, I mean I chose all the repertoire for every student. Thankfully, after 20 plus years of teaching, I have migrated from a teacher-centered to a student-centered approach. Repertoire selection is now a completely democratic process in my studio, the subject of an episode to come. But this reminds me that there was a time when the voice teacher had total control over the student, and not just with regards to the repertoire or vocal training. No, a student's entire life was in the hands of the teacher. Centuries ago, students would live with their teachers, act as servants to the household, and teachers would be charged with setting the student's moral and religious compasses. A master's hold over an apprentice was so great that they even had control over the singer's body, making choices for them that we would find absolutely unconscionable today. Now, obviously, we've come a long way since those days, but if we're not careful, elements of the master-apprentice model, now often called teacher-centered learning, can still sneak into our studios. So, how do we combat this? Hi, my name is David Sisco. My pronouns are he, him, and welcome to my new podcast, Wholehearted Voice Pedagogy. This podcast is dedicated to the art and practice of teaching singers. It is an extension of my forthcoming book of the same title, which will be published by Routledge Press in summer 2025. Today, we're going to talk about the master-apprentice model, how it was formed, how it impacted the student-teacher relationship, and how it can show up today. Our special guest is my colleague and friend, Justin Petersen, who I will be delighted to introduce you to in just a little bit. But first, a quick history lesson. Established by the 14th century, the master-apprentice model became an important way of training young people for particular jobs in pre-modern Europe. Historian Patrick Wallace explains that apprenticeship was a system of training in which young men, and less often young women, entered contracts to work for established craftsmen and merchants for a lengthy period, generally of some years, in exchange for an instruction in a craft or trade. The age at which a youth was engaged in service could vary greatly depending on the trade. Sometimes it was as early as 10 years old, but usually it was around the ages of 13 or 14. And this often guaranteed that the youth had a certain level of knowledge on which the master could build. Similarly varied were the number of years of service to the master, anywhere from 2 to 7, depending on the occupation and the training that was needed. At the time of engagement, the apprentice would leave their family home and go live with the master. In India, youths would go to gurukulas, homes in the forest where the master resided, and it was thought that living in nature during this time would help the apprentice limit distractions and wholly surrender themselves to gaining knowledge. In addition to their apprenticeship training, youths were also expected to act as servants to the household. So this means that the apprenticeship was legally binding indentured servitude. In addition to the contract, it was common for money to exchange hands at the time of signing. In some instances, families would actually pay a modest annual fee to keep their child engaged in the apprenticeship. Sometimes appropriate clothing or tools of the trade were actually subtracted from the apprentice's small wage. Now, once the apprentice had finished their study with the master, they became known as a journeyman. This allowed them to work as an employee in the field, potentially as a full employee with their master, if they so desired, or elsewhere. In order to receive the title of master craftsman, the journeyman would need to produce a masterpiece to the specifications of the legislating guild for assessment. Once approved as a master, the individual could open up their own shop and take on their own apprentices. Now, because being a musician was a risky vocation, yes, even back in the Baroque period, families did not take the decision of choosing a master for their child lightly. One historian notes that the choice of a master meant the choice of a career, and the success of training helped to determine the apprentice's success in later life. A young apprentice would take daily singing lessons with a master teacher and was therefore often not allowed to sing outside the master's presence. The master also taught the apprentice other instruments and provided music theory and other appropriate lessons. Now, similar to other professions, after the apprenticeship was complete, the musician would begin their journeyman period by traveling to other locales and continuing the education, learning from other musicians. Different financial arrangements, however, were negotiated for musical apprenticeships when compared to other trades. An apprentice's financial commitment to the master did not end with the apprenticeship. It was common for singers to owe some portion of their future salary to their masters. In the 18th century, for example, Nancy Phillips studied with her voice teacher for about 3 years. She was later hired as a singer for 6 seasons and paid her teacher a portion of her weekly salary, which was £6 and later rising to £12, in addition to paying half of her salary from her first appearance. Researcher Kim Burwell explains that music apprenticeship began to languish in the advent of conservatories in the 19th century because they supplied further specialization within the field. Designed by Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy, Leipzig Conservatoire in Germany was one of the first conservatories to establish specific curricular goals to train professional musicians. While the master-apprentice model ostensibly became obsolete, Brazilian educator and researcher Paulo Freire argued that elements of this model can still very much exist through his banking model theory. Musicologist Elwood Colahan writes, "The banking model has much in common with the master-apprentice model. Both support a rigid, hierarchical distinction between learner and teacher. Both are focused on preparing the learner to take his or her place in a system of economic or artistic production, whether on the factory floor or in an orchestral section. And both depend for their success on the internalization of their ideology by the learner. Like the apprenticeship system, banking education discourages critical interrogation of the nature of things, including those things pertaining to the relationship between the teacher and student. And like the apprenticeship system, banking education is arranged in such a way that one of its outcomes will invariably be to reproduce the relationships and conditions that brought it about in the first place." Whew. So now with all that information at hand, it is now my pleasure to introduce you to our special guest, Justin Petersen. Justin is an independent voice teacher based in Boston, Massachusetts. He has been on the voice faculty at Dean College, New England Conservatory Preparatory Program, and Stoneham Theater. Justin is the lead vocal coach for My College Audition, where he coaches students on all aspects of musical audition preparation for the competitive college audition process. His studio in Boston consists of actors, dancers, singers of opera, oratorio, musical theater, pop, and rock. Justin is also a prolific writer on historic and contemporary voice pedagogy and training. He writes a Substack entitled The Voice Teacher's Chrestomathy, which aims to distill and collect some of the best writings on voice training alongside practical application. I want to highly recommend this to you. Get on his email list. It's a fabulous resource. On a personal note, I turned to Justin several times when I was writing my book, precisely because of his immense knowledge and his open-heartedness. Justin, welcome to the podcast.
I'm over the moon to be here. I'm so excited.
I'm too. I'm so happy to have you here, and I'm happy for several reasons. One, because I know you're going to just share lots of great stuff with us, but also I get to kind of publicly thank you for being the first person to read my entire book and to offer such thoughtful feedback. I just know
Oh,
how grateful I am to you as a human being and as a colleague. It was very helpful to me.
well, I'm very humbled by that. And I feel so privileged to have been able to do it. It was kind of my first foray into doing that. So, I was like, oh, dust me off. I was like, look at me. I was pretty proud of myself. But no, it was great. And I think it is a well-intentioned and well-needed book. Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank
So
you.
thank you for writing it.
Oh my gosh, my pleasure. So you'll recall that in the first chapter, I gave a brief overview of the student-teacher relationship from the 16th to 20th centuries. Very light,
Just
easy
light,
reading.
light reading. Exactly.
And I did offer a little bit of that information to our podcast listeners today. And as we're talking about the master apprentice model, you had offered me some really valuable feedback
Mm.
that I think is a great framing device for what we're going to talk about today. And that is not to fall into the trap of presentism.
Yeah.
when looking at the master apprentice model. And I was just wondering if you could kind of define that and talk a little bit about that.
Well, I mean, there's several. I think the term presentism is the one that's used today. C.S. Lewis actually coined a term called chronological snobbery. So the guy who wrote the Narnia and all of that, he coined that phrase because he saw sort of this belief that the thinking, the art, the science, the culture of earlier times just are inherently inferior to our own simply by fact that they're remote from us
Mm,
historically. And so we sort of and presentism is what that is. It's sort of the idea that we exist in this time, that this is the best, like in Candide, the best of all possible worlds, right? And unfortunately, it's a rather narrow view of the times in which we live. Um, Lewis was explaining that the bias basically just dismisses past beliefs or wisdom as outdated or irrelevant without really examining the ideas before you discard them, right? So just because something is old, we're going to throw it away.
right.
Not because we've looked at it and said, actually, no, we've done a deep dive on this, and actually these ideas either don't work or maybe they do work.
And not just the ideas, but the context in which they live, right?
Correct, correct. Well, and this is my sort of argument with cultural relativism. We do live in an age now that's very culturally relativistic in terms of not, let's not judge another culture by their mores and their social, whatever. But yet we don't do that with history, which is a different culture,
Hmm.
right? It is a completely different culture. So if you were to go back to the 1960s in the United States, that is an entirely different culture than in the one which we live today,
Yeah.
operating under a completely different set of assumptions and social mores, behavior. Um, so I guess my plea or idea is that I want history to judge me with grace, and so I think I want to try to extend the same grace to history as well, right? Because we're
Sure.
also going to be judged by our descendants as well. So my intent always to just be more even-keeled and more open-eyed with things about history and then to just reject it. And I think presentism, because I think the new is always alluring, right?
Sure.
Even in vocal pedagogy, we're always like kind of chasing the new. It's like, oh, well, this is the latest research on X, Y, and Z, which is great. But we are also under a false impression that all progress is just inherently good. That's also another fallacy as well,
Hmm.
because the Greeks and the Romans, I'm sure, thought that their civilizations were fantastic and would just continually progress, progress, progress. But then the Huns were at the gates, and then we had the Dark Ages. So, so the idea that it's just always in an upward cycle is something we just need to hold in a little, hold a little lightly, I think. But yeah, you're right. The culture was different. That's the plea I think that I'm always trying to make is that
Yeah.
understanding the culture is it was just a very vastly different culture.
Yeah. And in writing about, the master apprentice model, I um, was trying to make a particular point that, there are elements of the master apprentice model that we do not hold as appropriate
Right.
today, right? Which is totally fine. But but there's a way to go about having that conversation without the judgment of of how things were done previously.
Right. Um, and that is where some of those missing pieces can be filled in. I think when people are knee-jerk reacting to this idea of master apprentice, they're knee-jerk reacting to it from this place of rejection of the past. Right. It's coming from a place of I'm just going to anything that was in the past is not valid, and we are better than those people are today, or those people were today. But I think when you really kind of dive into what some of those older teachers did for their students, I don't. There is no modern teacher that I know that would do for those students for their students what many of these students do today.
Mhm.
Um, we've talked about in our private conversations, but those relationships were largely familial because the Italian culture was very familial. It was a very familial culture. Like even if you were a peasant and you had a king, you still felt that the king was your father. I mean, there was this sort of fatherly role that was just hard baked into the Italian culture and the family culture. And so many of those voice teachers adopted those children. I mean, you know, come in and I'm going to adopt you and I'm going to live with you. And some of those students I mean, and at that time in Italy, it was greatly impoverished. Really wasn't until about 1800 that we had the Great Enrichment, where the
Mhm.
global wealth of the world exploded, and people actually began to have things like, money, access to things, like
Yeah.
candy bars. No, I'm just kidding. But no, but really, and before then, the world was absolutely impoverished. Global poverty prior to 1800 was devastatingly cruel. And so for many of these children who were coming to study, this was their gateway out of poverty, because many of these people, of these students were poor, and they were largely being trained for a profession, for a craft. It wasn't like today where there's a lot of avocational voice lessons, where you can study voice without the means of having a career. That would have been unknown, I think, in the 1700s, 1800s, unless you were royalty.
Sure.
So that tells you a little bit about culturally where those lines are drawn. People that can afford voice lessons without any hopes of a career is a rather privileged, wealthy, elite idea. So for those people, though, it was a craft, like learning how to build furniture or to do stonework or masonry, woodwork. That was a craft. Then it was considered to be such. So yeah, these voice teachers would adopt their children. Um, yeah, room and board. And at that time, people only had one outfit. That's always the thing I am amazed by. They had one pair of clothes, and that was it. I mean, the idea of Sunday best, you were lucky if you had Sunday best, because some people didn't have that at all. You might have
Sure.
two changes of clothes. So that's the cultural milieu in which all of this stuff is occurring. And we are unfortunate if we compare our model today to that model in the past, because they were operating under vastly separate and different assumptions and needs culturally.
Totally.
Yeah,
Totally. Yeah.
for sure.
Um, I think the other challenge that I came across as I was writing that chapter was in my studio. I tell my students, I'm like, I'm not interested in good or bad sound. That is wholly
Mm,
subjective, right?
hmm.
I'm interested in, is this sustainable or is this unsustainable,
Yes.
right? Can you keep on doing this, right? And I think where I was, this chapter was probably the hardest one to write for me. Um, where it was initially coming from a good bad place.
Hmm.
And and so what I'm really interested in now and where I finally hopefully ended with the chapter is what is sustainable and what is not sustainable based on where we are culturally, based on how we interact with students, based on the information that we have that they did not have,
Right.
right? And so I know that you have some examples and I have some that I wanted to share too
Mm.
that we could just maybe talk about the good, the bad, the ugly,
Sure.
as we would say
Right.
of Master Apprentice. And the
Right.
first thing I want to share that came to me as I was researching this book called the Practical Reflections on the Figurative Art of Singing,
Yes.
1774,
Yes.
Giambattista Mancini. And he talks about being a student and watching older students do these tailor-made vocal exercises that were more
Mm.
advanced than
Hmm.
his teacher was giving him. And he asked his teacher, I want to do this. Let me do this. And the teacher says, okay, I'm going to let you do that. And when he does it and it doesn't go well, the teacher says, and this is a quote, I admire and praise your desire, but cannot encourage you to do this way because it would disturb the good order of your training and that would harm you. So continue your graded method and study patiently, and in short time, you will reach your companions and gain the same glory. Which is actually a very student-centered
Yes.
approach. Like you want to
Totally.
do this. Okay, I'm going to let you do this. I'm
Yes.
not going to gaslight you. I'm
Hmm.
not going to like say, see, this is why you don't do this. I'm
That's right.
saying I'm going to give you an opportunity to do this and say,
Hmm.
okay, now I'm going to show you why we're doing this
Hmm.
in the order that we're doing it, right?
Correct.
Like,
Well, I always think of this is going to be funny, but I always think of Karate Kid. I'm a big Karate Kid fan. I grew up in the 80s. So,
same.
and we had Karate Kid on like repeat on my in my house. There is that moment when Daniel is really frustrated by all of this work that his teacher is having him do, right? This wax on, wax off, paint fence, scrub floor, whatever. He doesn't see the connections that the
Right,
teacher can see,
right.
right? So in master apprentice modeling, the teacher can often see students' means that a student cannot see. It takes that, finally he reaches out to his teacher and says, "Listen, I'm not learning anything. When am I going to learn karate? When are you going to teach me, what to do?" And then he runs him through the whole panoply of stuff that he's been doing the entire time, which has always been uh, karate. He just didn't know it. And then, of course, he's shocked. He's like, "Oh, I was learning the whole time, and I didn't even know that I was learning the whole time." So I always kind of take that model as a wonderful example that students often don't understand the maneuvers of waxing off and, wax on, wax off, because they cannot see down the road where the teacher can, and because the teacher's been there, or they've tread the path that few have
Sure.
trod.
Right.
To quote a musical, right? So I think that the value system of allowing students, well, here's another thing. With the historical teachers, they did something also that we don't do, which was they would write compositions for their students based on their
Right.
technical skills.
Right.
So, I mean, imagine a voice teacher of today sitting down to write a composition for a student and say, "Oh, I wrote you a song that is addressing your particular technical problems. Here you go." That would be
That's
a graded
pretty,
material.
that's pretty darn student-centered.
I mean, I'd say,
Like,
I think
you
so.
know,
And
and
everybody got different songs. You know what I mean? Everybody
right.
got different material to work on. I mean, it was addressing their particular technical. It wasn't like fit, square peg into round hole. It was, "Oh no, here's where you are." And this is why graded repertoire in the teaching studio is such a helpful thing, I believe, because you're able to know where a student is at and know what you have access to in order to
Sure.
give the student that sort of same level of service and care.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
that's one story out of many, within the master apprentice model. But then, I know in Janice Chapman's book, in Singing and Teaching and Singing, she talks about the fact that the master's power over the
Mhm.
singer was so great that they could decide to castrate
Right.
a young male singer in order to keep them a soprano, right?
Right.
So,
And that's so loaded. And I'd love to just sort of, unpack that a little bit because we look again on that to us moderns. Of course, we look on that and we're absolutely mortified and horrified that that would ever be a thing. Even culturally at the time, I think it wasn't, even in England, it was considered to be, barbaric to do that
sure.
at the time. But I think what was going on in that situation was several things. One was the training would have to be redone after the voice would change, so that would be a loss of time. Which I'm not defending these ideas per se, but I'm again trying
Totally.
to put them into a cultural context. Um, and also, sometimes the families were pushing that as well, because for the child to make money as a singer, the family would also benefit. So there was always the family with the child was always part of this, equation. Although there are some contracts where teachers did say they did make a contract with the family to say, I'm going to reserve the right to basically castrate your child. Um, but I also want to put this into a frame of a modern context. We still live in a culture that seeks to do elective surgery for people to pursue success in the performing arts. That still happens today in Hollywood. People still go under the knife in Hollywood and have surgical procedures in order to get money. Again, that impulse, the impulse of betterment, the impulse of becoming more of gaining a higher social standing.
Mhm.
Uh, that still is with us today. That impulse, maybe not to that degree, but
Sure.
that impulse is still very much there to look a certain way, to have a certain kind of an appearance on screen.
Outcome. Yes.
Outcome, that's very much still alive with us today. It's just transmitted into a different channel.
Right. Right. Hopefully, they're making that decision.
Correct. Correct. No one's making it for them. Although that may not be true as well, because there are agents and press people who will say, you really, or directors who will say, you really need to, might want to get some work done here. So
Sure.
there is pressure as well from external forces, I do believe, to,
Right.
do that kind of stuff,
Yeah.
which is a not healthy world to, I don't think, but that's neither here nor
Yeah.
there.
So I think what we're highlighting is that there's more connection here
Correct.
um, than maybe initially meets the eye, right?
Correct.
So we have these kind of newer ways of thinking about teaching,
Mhm.
teacher-centered and student-centered. And I'm wondering if you could share some examples, because I know you know so much about Master Apprentice, some examples of um, models of teacher-centered and student-centered, and what are some things that are worth keeping, and what
Mm.
are some things that are worth letting go of?
Well, I think oftentimes with the master apprentice model, I think people are rejecting what in a priori feels as though it's some sort of a psychological abuse, because teachers don't want to be seen as being psychologically abusive, right? In our modern, hopefully, we hope,
Right.
right? Hope springs eternal when you're, judging the best of humanity. But I think there's a desire to separate oneself from that feeling of, master, what we could call rather authoritarian impulse,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
To hold over someone in that sense and to have that sort of mental power. I think a lot of people were trained in that way of thinking, but I'm also going to go deeper on this. I think that that I take this quote from Uta Hagen. I'm not going to say it right, but she would always say that the teacher's chair is a very dangerous one because it leads to coteries and it leads to an inflamed sense of the self in terms of who you are. That is endemic in any teacher-student relationship, I think, that we always have to be on guard for. That the inflated ego, the sense of power over someone's life, there are many people who love the feeling of power over other human beings. And that would be that's just human nature, right? That's something we have to be on guard for as teachers, I think, to be the one and only authority. And this is one of the things in my own teaching, what I always try to tell students is, I never want to do anything in your singing that makes you mistrust your own body or your own rational mind or your own rational reflexes,
Yeah.
so that everything is concordant with who you are as a person, that you never feel a separateness with the self, but rather an enlargement of the self in learning to sing. So I think
Beautiful.
people are really largely reacting against that sort of tyrannical control, which I've always rejected. But here's the thing I'll also say. We're always under the influence of transference as human beings. And if you don't know transference, that's Freud's principle that we're bringing past relationships into present relationships, whether or not we're conscious of it or not. There is a strain of particular pedagogy that I'm thinking of that started in the 1920s with a particular teacher in New York City, which not only created a system of intense mechanized body work, but also was highly psychologically abusive. The unfortunate thing is the people that were abused under that particular strain of pedagogy continued on that abuse on their own students because it was sort of like this heirloom, this family pedagogical heirloom that they just sort of passed down and gave to other, students. But also within that master apprentice model, there were countless tales of teachers that were selfless and loving and generous and kind. They were human beings. Um, Many of the students would call their voice teacher father because there was such an intense relationship there within that development, that the teacher had done so much work, almost like a father would do.
Yeah.
So we have both. We have stories from both. You have these selfless, beautiful human beings that gave up, their homes, fed these students, handled their contracts, and these other students, other teachers were highly abusive, and that continues all the way into the 20th century. I mean, Etude magazine is a particular favorite of mine to read early 20th century thought on teaching voice before the Nats Journal, right? So this is kind of like if you wanted to go
Sure.
back before the Nats Journal, what was available, and Etude magazine is kind of that. And they as well are casting aspersions against voice teachers that are abusive and yell and scream and like there was good teaching. There's always been good teaching and there's always been bad teaching. That is a constant. That is a constant. Teachers that were abusive, that destroyed their spirits. One particular anecdotal story that I've heard is one student when they were abused to the degree that they lost their voice, right? They lost their singing voice because of the torment, and then turned to substance abuse to sort of self-medicate the pain of what they had been going through and losing their voice. Now, to me, that is almost inhumane to do that to another human being. Um, but the history books are full of torturously devilish teachers who did terrible things to their students. And then there are stories of teachers who were selfless and giving, and their students couldn't have repaid them enough. Manuel Garcia, who was the son of Manuel Garcia I, was one of the great 19th century voice teachers. And students would come just to sit in on the lessons when he taught in London and Paris, just to take in that sort of artistic, education and what was going on there.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I think history, we should reject abuse. We should reject cruelty in our voice studios completely. But we also can look to the beautiful example. The quote you just shared with from Mancini. There's another anecdote in that book where he talks about a student that he had received who hadn't been able to be successful with other teachers. Now, see, that to me is an indication that even in the height, of the bel canto period, which is, and Mancini wrote his book around 1777. So we're talking around, the Enlightenment era, that these other teachers just couldn't get success with this student.
Mhm.
So, we also have this idea that, oh, well, everybody who studied bel canto just succeeded and everybody who took on those lessons just became a rock star. Well, no, because the student that Mancini is talking about also went through that same process with teachers and they couldn't do anything for him. And it
Yeah.
was Mancini himself who saw something in the student. He saw something there that he was like, I think there might be something to cultivate here. And that was what brought him into his work with him in his studio. And then the student became a very celebrated singer in Europe. He doesn't say who it is because he's probably protecting their privacy. But they became successful. They did become a successful singer in Europe.
I think part of that presentism that we were talking about earlier is, this desire to know and to lay claim
Hmm.
to something. I know this, and therefore, right? Which is its own kind of power,
Sure, it is.
right?
Absolutely. And the negation of the past has always been a totalitarian impulse,
Mm.
a destructive totalitarian impulse.
So there's the desire to know, right? Or think we know,
Right.
to name and to claim. Um, and that also suppresses the um, necessity of being curious,
I think
right?
so. And one of the things I've always said is no one in science or mathematics would make a contribution in their field without knowing their literature, without knowing the accumulated literature of what had come before. It
Mhm.
seems to be strange that in vocal pedagogy, it's the one area where people think they can disabuse themselves of reading anything that's prior to 1999, as if there was no accumulated knowledge that occurred before then, or it's so outdated it's irrelevant. That to me is shocking. And I think in vocal pedagogy departments, I'm always ringing the bell for, yeah, read the literature. Read the historical thinking on how people have thought about what we're doing here so that when you do make your contribution, you're not going to come out and say, oh, I invented the semi-occluded vocal tract exercise. Or I
Right,
invented the lip trill. What? I mean, people who, scientists who would do that would be laughed off the stage. A doctor
right,
who would come out to present something on, oh, I figured out how the heart beats and how blood goes through the body. They'd be like, yeah, dude, we've known that since like 1400s or something. Like
right.
you didn't make that up. But I think also too there is. Are we going to go to church? Are we going to have church right now?
We're gonna have church.
Um, there is a tendency in the social media world for teachers to gain popularity or audiences or influence by promulgating these ideas that they have somehow invented something, right? I've
Yeah,
made something up and that's what makes me special. Well, and the hapless student who doesn't have any knowledge of this will say, oh, wow, cool. That's awesome. And so for me, as a person who cares so much about history, I always go, I kind of wryly go, sure, Janice. Yeah. But no, I mean, that's, I think, what history does for us. It gives us a breadth and a scope of understanding of where ideas have come from. And that's always been my interest is where did these ideas come from? Where do ideas come from? How do we think about these things?
and
And
how do
I've
we
always loved to pull those threads. I love to pull those threads.
totally, and then how do we intersect with them, and how do we, how do we um, think about, as we've been talking about, the culture in which those ideas and those practices existed, and how things have changed, and
Yes.
and really reflect on that in a humble way.
Yes.
It was in preparation for the semester. I was going through my syllabus, as I do. I rewrite my syllabus like every semester. I cannot help myself. I always find something I need to like fix. And I read something that I had in the syllabus for years. And it just said, at the end of the lesson, I will tell you what to work on for the next week. And I was like, oh, no.
Mhm.
We're going to discuss that together. We're going to
Mhm.
talk about that together. We'll figure that out together, right? And it's so interesting. I mean, and I think when I was a younger teacher, that's what I did. I'm
Sure.
like, okay, great. And it wasn't in a necessarily an authoritarian way or like a,
Mm.
like you will do this,
Right.
but in like, I want you to work on this and this and this, right? That's fine. But it didn't invite conversation,
Mhm.
in the way that I wrote it. And I was like,
Yeah.
oh, I don't like that. And it, it doesn't put the student in the center of it has the potential to not put the student in the center of their experience,
Truly.
right?
Truly. And on the other side of that, then I have a question. You know, with student-centered learning, one of the interests that I have is not all students carry the same amount of discipline,
Sure.
right?
Right.
So the idea that a student this is where I kind of say, well, that's where guidance comes in, right? To be able to help them in that capacity. Um, and they do have to lift the weight. You know what I mean? It's like, because I think what we're doing is a skill in the same sense as if they hired a personal trainer. It's not
Right.
just it's not brain work. You know what I mean? Because there are very smart people who can't sing and very great singers who aren't so smart. Right? I
That's
mean,
going to be
that's
the
true.
tagline. That'll be the
That's
tagline
just
for this
truth.
episode.
Sorry, if it hurts, get some, get a heating pad and deal with it. Just get a heating pad and deal with it. Um, but in the acquisition of skill, a physical skill, for someone to be able to have repetition or to understand, scope of what we're going to be doing,
Yeah.
um, there is a level I think there of guidance because sometimes a student, I would feel as my anxious self, I'd be overwhelmed because I would say, well, I don't know what to do, and I don't know which direction to go in. Uh, so that's where a teacher can come in and say, well, let me help you. I also think there's a psychological calm that comes from that kind of guidance, knowing that the teacher can help that you're on a track. There's
Totally.
nothing worse than what my dear, wonderful friend Eden Castile calls lessons to nowhere, where it's
Mm,
just like, where are we going? I don't know what's going on. I don't know what the development plan is. I don't know what we're aiming for. And
totally.
obviously that invites a conversation with the student as well. But sometimes the student doesn't want to go anywhere. you know Sometimes a student just doesn't want is happy to just show up and do the thing and then come back next week. So yeah, I think because it's a physical skill, there is a sense of just a little bit of nurturing that can go on, like you're saying, to say,
Right.
well, let's think about this. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
how and what you're saying is individualizing, right?
Of
Every
course.
student, right? And which of course we hopefully are all practicing. It's like every student, some students are self-starters and I'm like,
Yes.
see what we did? And they're like, got
Hmm.
it. I'm on it,
I'm on it.
And then
Yes.
other folks where you're just like, I'm just going to lead you down a little further on this path,
Yes, that's right.
just so you
That's right.
know exactly like this is the path that we're walking,
That's right.
and then when you're practicing you're going to walk that same path, and there's a way to still be student centered about that,
Of course.
right?
Well, it's also
um
why I love the word from history, voice cultivation.
Say more.
That they are, there was this sort of bifurcation in language in the 19th century where voice teaching was, before that, had been considered to be voice culture. And I don't mean culture in the sense of like, dance culture or something like that, but really like cultivation, the idea of how, like plant culture, how do we cultivate a plant? How do we grow a
Mhm.
plant? Um, and then in the 19th century, you get this language shift, which is voice production. Well, that's a factory language, right? That's process, that's product oriented, right?
Right.
One is process oriented. Cultivation is a process. Production is a product. And those are very, very different mindsets
Yeah.
about how to work with the singer, with the voice. I always take the cultivation route because I grew up on a farm. My father is a landscaper. I grew up around trees. So my whole zeitgeist, my whole mental thought process is about letting things grow and observing them grow. How do they grow? I'm very lucky that I was close to nature as a child growing up.
Mm.
So I went through the seasons. I saw how things developed. I saw animals being born. I saw animals dying. They're very much a direct path to nature and natural processes. So my teaching is very much predicated in that same energy. Um, and I don't know where I was going with this, but it's really good.
It
uh,
is.
yeah, no, but yeah,
Well,
this product, yeah, this decision about product and cultivating a student, and you're the question we have to ask ourselves. I'm gonna get deep. What are we doing as teachers of voice? What is it that we are literally doing? I don't think we think about that enough.
Hmm.
We don't have those deep conversations about what does it mean from a humanitarian position to be a voice teacher? What is it that I'm hoping to instill in people in the future? I want people to gain a sense of themselves in an enlarged way that they never knew possible, to self-actualize through singing, but also to gain knowledge, appreciation, and love of beautiful things. That their life can be, that they can get so much meaning in their life from beauty, from being surrounded by loveliness, whether that's visual art or musical art. That's what I want to inculcate in my students. It's not about scales.
Right.
Scales are merely a tool to get to there, to get to that place. But what good do we do our students if we train them to sing and we don't open up their souls and we don't open up who they are as human beings? There's so many lessons to learn in voice lessons that are not just vocal.
Oh, amen.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. But this
I have
idea,
two quotes. Can I share two quotes that I had pulled for today that
oh
I'd
my
love to
gosh,
just
please.
share? This
Yes.
is first one is this is again on this idea of history, but this is a quote from Michael Reeves. He is the president and professor of theology at Union School of Theology in Oxford, England. And he wrote this wonderful paragraph. He says, "But what C.S. Lewis found, and what reading old books makes very clear, is that every age works with a large set of assumptions that seem to it so self-evident that they are never questioned. Like the proverbial frog in the kettle, we find it almost impossible to get a real sense of the water we inhabit, and can thus be blissfully unaware of how faddish our beliefs are. It is very tempting for me now to don the grand airs of a sage cultural critic and attempt to list what our unquestioned assumptions are today. But anyone reading this in 50 years' time, would only chuckle at the profound issues I had overlooked. They are simply part of the air we breathe every day, and as such are quite invisible to us."
Mm.
And then moving on, this is the quote from Lewis that I absolutely love. "It is a good rule, after reading a new book, never to allow yourself another new one till you have read an old one in between. If that is too much for you, you should at least read one old one to every 3 new ones. Not, of course, that there is any magic about the past. People were no cleverer than they are now. They made as many mistakes as we, but not the same mistakes.
Mm.
They will not flatter us in the errors we are already committing, and their own errors, being now open and palpable, will not endanger us. 2 heads are better than one, not because either is infallible, but because they are unlikely to go wrong in the same direction. To be sure, the books of the future would be just as good a corrective as the books of the past, but unfortunately, we cannot get at them." Isn't that marvelous?
That is
Oh,
marvelous. You're
goosebumps.
marvelous. Thank you,
Isn't
my
that
friend.
wonderful? Oh,
It's
love it.
really, really great. I really
Yeah.
appreciate your knowledge and your your compassionate knowledge is how I
Yes.
want to say that.
Yes.
And your desire to engage with knowledge, as you said before we hit record,
Mm.
but to engage with knowledge from a sense of service. And
Yes,
that's very
100%.
apparent, very
Yes.
apparent.
To be of service. Yes,
Yeah.
100. That's my core value. One of my core values. Absolutely. Is to be of service.
Thank you so much.
Terrific.
More soon.
Yes, thank you.
How familiar were you with the master-apprentice model? Have you experienced elements of a teacher-centered approach as a student? And are there ways that you might consider being more student-centered in the voice studio. Sound off. You can email me at wholeheartedvoicepedagogy@gmail.com or find me on the socials. My handle on most platforms is at Sisco Songs or at Wholehearted Voice Pedagogy. I would love to hear from you. These conversations I think are so important. And please do subscribe to this podcast on whatever corner of the interweb you found it. I'll be releasing new episodes every 2 weeks, and I can promise you, you will not want to miss some of the phenomenal guests I have coming down the pike. More soon. Take care of you.